Bonjour. Hello, and thank you everyone to be here for the economic session in X. Those are unusual conditions this year because from the studios of Maison de la Radio. This session theme is not unusual because it's a worrying concern for policymakers and economists. The idea is how to build fiscal justice to achieve social justice. What terms of taxation policy? What sort of evolutions? Should we consent to tax? How to limit it? Those will be the question asked in this session. And we'll listen to Ludovic Subran, who's a director of economy at Allianz. And we'll have prestigious panelists such as Mauricio Cardenas, who's teaching at the University of Columbia and was a former finance minister. Pascal Saint-Amand, working at the OECD. Jacob von Weizsäcker, Mohamed Soual, and Hubert Seguin with us in the studio. You work at Herbert Smith Frears. Thank you all to agree to participate in this session. So Ludovic, I'll let you address the subject. Thank you, Isabelle, and thank you for our speakers. After coronavirus, the idea was to rebuild fiscal justice and social justice. So we try to address 4 topics. The first one is how to answer through tax to the coronavirus crisis, and also this economic purgatory in which we stand, and this sanitary crisis has become an economic and social crisis, and maybe it will be a tax crisis, so this is what we'll be talking about. Second, and maybe a subject which is overused in the media is that of what kind of best idea for taxation, because many people ask themselves if it would not be possible to change tax, such as green tax, digital tax. And the question is, and this is the third topic, how will we be able to pay the trillions that we put in our economy, because it's more than 20% GDP. So who is going to pay? And will people agree to pay again? Will they consent to tax? Or will there be a deep pocket syndrome? Because we've been told that we had no money any longer, but then because of the COVID, money came back. So people might think, well, it's no use paying. And then the last topic is that of social justice. And after coronavirus, that revealed inequalities, but the question is how to rebuild public policies, how to redistribute, how to find social equity through this rebuilding era, and can tax be used to reduce inequalities? So I'll immediately hand the floor to our speakers, and the first topic will be how can we have a tax answer to give to the coronavirus, and what about the countries and their different policies? So Pascal, you'll tell us about the G20 report. Thanks a lot, and have a nice afternoon for this XN, which is a new place where the session is held. Now, concerning tax policy, there are different phases, and the best policies which corresponds to the best phase. So first there was the crisis, and the idea was to react at any cost, to delay payments, to exempt people from tax, to stop extra hours for people in the health sector. So the first was to react at any cost. The second phase was to improve the economy, and we will need to have more targeted measures. So if we only have one measure for all cafes, bars, and restaurants, then there will be no difference with those benefiting from a terrace and others. So we have to target our decisions. And then third point is how to go out, and the idea is not to rush into austerity. We have to take time before having consolidated taxes, and then we'll need to use the proper tools in terms of tax. Thank you, Pascal. Jacob, let me hand you the floor. I work for Allianz, and this is not a secret, but we're all admirative when we look at Germany's response to the health and economic crisis. So you just announced a reduction of VAT, so we're quite interested in your input.
J'espère que tu peux m'entendre.
Oh, I hope you can hear me.
English language channel for some reason, and so I'll try to speak in English. Let me start by saying, while it is tempting being closely involved in some of the policy design in the COVID response in Germany, it is tempting to think one of the reasons why so far things have gone reasonably benignly in Germany because of the quality of Germany's civil servants. I think that the simple truth is we were lucky that we were not in the first wave of the countries which had to react. So we had a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but they were critical, where we were able to learn from the experiences of other countries. And so I think one really mustn't get carried away in imagining that simply it's due to the sort of public decision making that we're in a slightly better position. I think to a large extent it was a luck, and we were lucky, and there's no guarantee that it will stay that way. By the way, if you think about a second wave, it can happen anywhere, and we need to be watchful. But you asked me about our tax policies, and I would perhaps start with VAT. I think what I would start with is a number of tax policy measures that have provided the corporate sector with a lot of additional liquidity, simply by allowing them to pay their taxes a little bit later, and also by allowing them to retroactively do a calculation where they can say we make colossal losses now, but we made a lot of profits earlier, and so wouldn't it be possible to get reimbursed on some of the taxes we pay on our profits earlier, simply by doing the sums of the losses today and the profits yesterday. Normally it would be a calculation where you do the sum of the losses today and the profits in the future. And again, by allowing this backward-looking calculation, we provided companies with a lot of liquidity, and I think that was quite effective and very helpful. And it's something that can be done rapidly. We were definitely not the only country doing it. On the VAT, it's going to be a very interesting experience. I think there's the multiplier may not be highest. Probably the most effective measure we have in our portfolio of consumption strengthening measures is the child benefit for middle and low income families. But one of the interesting characteristics of the temporary VAT cut is that in those areas where the constraint is not capacity, but it's demand, in all likelihood, the pass-through of the VAT cut will be reasonably good to prices and benefit consumers, and therefore have a stimulating effect that way. In areas where the COVID shock is much more supply shock, where companies are supply constrained, and demand isn't too much of a problem, then miraculously the VAT cut is not going to be passed through as much for obvious economic reasons, and will enhance the profitability of those companies who are suffering from severe supply constraint. That's of course not something that will always go in the right direction. You could have companies, I don't know, online commerce, they're very profitable now, and if they don't pass it through, they'd be even more profitable in the future. But that is an interesting characteristic, and I'm much looking forward to seeing studies afterwards looking at the extent to which the price pass-through is happening in different sectors.
Merci Jacob. Et en fait, en effet, on ne t'a pas laissé parler français alors que tu...
Thank you, Jacob. We didn't let you speak French, but even if you speak French better than I do. Anyway, thank you for shedding a light on this VAT approach in Germany from 20 to 16. That could be a good message for our next finance minister in France. So since we're going around the world, here I'd like to ask Mauricio Cardenas on tax measures in emerging countries. From your standpoint of Columbia University and your former function as Minister of Finance of Colombia, how did emerging countries manage the response to the crisis, fiscally speaking, or tax with their tax measures? Wait, yes.
Oui.
Ludovic,
Nous vous entendons très bien.
Hearing you.
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you. We can hear you. No problem.
Continue. I'm assuming that you can hear me well because I stopped hearing you.
Yes, everything's okay. We can hear you. No problem. No problem. We can hear you very well.
Mauricio Cardenas, on vous entend très bien. On entend aussi l'interprète, donc
Hello.
je vous en
Can
prie.
you hear me well? Should I continue?
Yes, continue, please. We hear you very well. Everything's perfect. Can you hear me?
On est dans une situation logistique un peu particulière avec un...
This is a bit... we have guests from all over the planet, and sometimes the connections are not perfect. Maybe we can continue with Hubert Seguin. You're specialized in business law. What is the future of taxing for corporations, for businesses in this post-COVID context, even if we're not there yet? But I think that we can start with 3 observations. The first is that the debt of France could reach between 120 to 140 of the GDP soon. Second observation is that more than 1 million businesses that have asked for the help, support of the state, and the failure of companies will increase strongly in 2021. Unemployment now, we're planning on 11.25% by 2021. If you put in parallel these observations with the fact that France already taxes at a level of 50%, so it means that it's the highest in the OECD. So I think you have the answer to the question. We're already in bad position, so we have to look at the 2 options. The first option would be to increase taxes to reduce the debt. But you can make the businesses more fragile, or you can adopt the other option, is to lower the fiscal burden to increase growth. So the first option, if you start by reimbursing the post-COVID debt by the increase of taxes, Obviously, the government announced and repeated frequently that there wouldn't be any tax rises. It was hammered because I think for the moment nobody believes in that. But we do see there's a strong political pressure to make this fiscal burden, this tax burden increase. But it's so much easier to increase taxes than to control public expenditures. And this, of course, when you talk to the voters who don't pay taxes, and there are a lot who think that the good tax is the tax you don't pay. So I'm flabbergasted when I see a survey that was published in the newspaper at The Echoes, which reported that 75% of the people thought that creating an exceptional taxation would be efficient to relaunch the economy. And I think it's not today's subject, or going back to the tax to the wealthy, which is called ISF in France. So I think it's another debate, but it's important here. In my opinion, increasing taxes, and we see this in our trade, in my business, is counterproductive. The first reason is that France is the country where the compulsory taxing is the highest. Secondly, we forget that we live in an open world. Always remember of the tax evasions of capitals, for example, in foreign countries during François Hollande's presidency, when he was in office, when he announced a 75% tax, for example. I think that during this period, I went from corporate lawyer to specialist in changing citizenship. You know, how do I move my my business to another country? And we forget that, you know, evasion, you know, leaving the country. If you think of the richest Swiss people, more than 60 are 300 millionaires. 60 are French. The UK left UK will leave Europe, has left Europe, and how will it attract capital? Well, it will lower its taxes. The Germans did that by enabling easier terminations of its labor forces. So they changed the labor laws for that purpose. Flexibility, let's say. And when you look at the report of the Court of Accounts, in France, you shouldn't increase the fiscal burden, the tax burden. That's the recommendation. I think that if you want to relaunch consumption, you have to lower social charges, changing the tax levels, for example. I think these tax breaks must encourage entrepreneurship, encourage consumption, encourage people to work, and encourage services. So you talked about international competition, tax competition between the states, and there's this topic of a possible green taxation. Well, with all this, let's try to go back to Mauricio Cardenas. Mauricio Cardenas, can you hear us now? Perfect. Yes, perfectly well. We can hear you perfectly well. We're listening. Good.
The technological issues were resolved. Thank you very much for having me in this panel. I'm delighted to be part of this conference. I only miss not being in X at this great time of the year, but thank you anyway. And we hope that with this technology, we're able to participate actively. Taxation is the elephant in the room. No one wants to talk about it now, but everyone knows that it's present and it's unavoidable to start the discussion and the conversation about taxation. The main reason, and I'm speaking with the perspective of emerging economies, is that debt levels are increasing very fast. Every country in Latin America has been increasing the fiscal deficit, and debt to GDP ratios are going to be increasing by somewhere between 10 to 20 percentage points. So for many countries, the issue of debt sustainability is now becoming a very pressing point. Rating agencies are about to take actions in terms of downgrades. Therefore, the discussion about taxation, it's going to take place. Not now, because we're still in an early phase of the pandemic, where the levels of contagion are increasing. The pandemic has been dramatic for Latin America, and this is a side comment. The main reason has to do with informality, an issue that we will have to discuss also from the taxation point of view. But informality has been the greatest enemy of the pandemic because people need to go out and work. And informality is by definition activities that are based on human contact. Therefore, the pandemic has been very severe. So we are moving from the preservation stage, which is essentially trying to preserve life, trying to preserve incomes, and governments responding very fast with very aggressive measures to provide more revenues for the health sector and also to provide more income to households. But we're going to start moving towards the end of this year to the recovery phase. That would also require significant amounts of government expenditures to make sure that economies start growing again. And therefore, at the end of these two phases, the preservation phase and the recovery phase, we'll have a very significant fiscal problem. Taxation will become the dominant issue next year. Most countries are going to start discussing how to reduce the deficits and how to reduce debt, to do some form of debt consolidation. Now, the issues in terms of taxation for Latin America have to do essentially with personal income taxes, which are very low in terms of the share of total fiscal revenues, and also a key issue for income distribution. So personal income taxation is going to take the center stage in this conversation. But not just this. We'd also have to start the discussion, a serious discussion about digital taxation for the region, very much under the umbrella of the OECD. I'm so delighted that Pascal is part of this panel. But also carbon taxation. There are only 3 countries in the region, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, that have introduced carbon taxes. Many countries are still subsidizing energy. So cutting those subsidies is also going to be a central issue in the conversation. And for some countries, including my country, which is Colombia, land taxes will also be very important in this discussion. So as you can see, this is a pending discussion in which the coronavirus will be a catalyzer, because these are not new issues, but the coronavirus will accelerate the challenges that are associated with low taxation and the need for fiscal reform. Thank you very much.
Alors, très précisément, c'est exactement la deux.
That is exactly the second question that we are asking ourselves concerning this debate. That is how to finance the debt, how to finance the spendings of states to support the economy. Are we heading towards some sort of a competition of fiscal inventivity? You were talking about digital tax, green tax, but what about you, Pascal Saint-Amand? What are the work of the OECD on the subject and on digital taxation more particularly? Concerning increase of tax, we need to find, countries will need to find a way to support the debt level, and to support this level with the very low interest rates does not mean to increase tax strongly. Now, secondly, we will not decrease tax because if we decrease tax everywhere and massively for the recovery, and if we think about populism and nationalism growing, is because of the delocalization that have been accepted, such as the end of bank secrecy, for instance. So being very inventive in terms of tax, I think, in fact, we will need to readapt tax. So digital taxing can be used so that digital companies will have to pay more taxes, and most of them are American, and they are taxed by at least 13% in the USA. because there was a minimum global tax for the American companies. So digital companies, we have to work upon it, and we are trying to work upon it and hope to solve this question by the end of the year. Secondly, and this is what Mauricio said, green fiscality, green tax. 70% of greenhouse gases are taxed at a zero level, which is not much. Now, of course, when we want to tax carbon, people put on yellow jackets. So there's a question of reforming the economy. And then last point is what Mauricio said concerning capital tax, because the level of inequalities is such and will be such after COVID that we'll need to look at those questions. This is what the Democrats and the Republicans are discussing in the US. And in Switzerland, some Conte tried to vote against the tax which allows billionaires not to be taxed much. So the question we are asking is how to ease investments and where to tax, because we know where capital stands. And we know that more than 10,000 billion euros have been exchanged, and we know how to tax those capitals without them evading to foreign countries. Now, on the question of a new taxation, I'd like to listen to Mohamed Soual, especially on carbon tax. Thank you. I'm sorry. I was disconnected for a while. But now we can hear you very clearly. Okay, perfect. So I'd like to come back to a point which seems important to me, and which is the exceptional era we've lived recently, and the current aspect, because we know that since the Middle Ages, taxation was at the core of the relationship between the citizen and the state, the citizen and the country. And taxation and its principles depend a lot upon the agreements within a civil society and the body in charge of representing it. As Jean-Edouard Codard said, taxation is a palimpsest where tensions and agreements are written within civil society. So I think that we mustn't suffer from the pressure of current events, even though the crisis is a deep one, so deeply seated that we might need some time before recovering. But I think that humanity has gone through such events, and if we look at the last century, we've had very deep crisis also. Now, concerning the precise question you asked, I'd like to state a few things. Coming from Morocco, being born in Morocco, and living in a country wishing to develop, there is also the question of justice, global justice, that we need to address and examine very closely. If we look at Paris agreements for the COP21, there was an unanimous agreement where $100 billion were to be allocated to accompany endeavors to adapt and to be used by developing countries. But it suddenly stopped, and this is not due to the current crisis. But the current crisis obviously won't help us find the money back. Now, if I look at Africa at large, it means less than 4% of greenhouse gases. I often use the image of Morocco. If you take Morocco throughout a year, the greenhouse gas is less than 4 minutes of the United States throughout the year. And I'm not mentioning the Chinese. So those are very complex questions because within they stand within a country and also at a global scale. However, it is obvious that, and maybe this is less the case in terms of taxation, and I heard you when you talked about carbon taxation, but there's also the question of finance. Let me take the example of my corporation. We absolutely wish to go forward and use green taxation, and we were financed by international banks such as AFB, KfW in Germany, and other corporations concerning questions to mitigate the industrial impact to desalt seawater so as to preserve a vital element in a country, my country, where water is a hot topic. So those questions are really important, and I wish to dwell upon this point. And I think taxation should be favorable to financing, to green financing, rather than green tax, especially in our countries where climate problems and global warming are less effective than in strongly industrialized countries that are, for most part, responsible for those greenhouse gases. Now, concerning... Okay, let's try and move forward with the debate, because we talked about this very specific question, an essential question of green taxation. We talked about the debt problem. Now, the health sanitary crisis has become an economic crisis. States invested massively. For France, there is approximately 500 billion of investment with guaranteed loans, but there is also 150 billion direct intervention. And this is somehow some sort of a magic money. This is the formula used. Could this change the perception of the taxpayers, be they individuals or corporations, in their connection to the public power and their agreement to tax? So, Herbert Seguin, what do you think about this phase we're living right now, especially concerning corporations?
I think this brings back on the consent to taxes. When you see this wave of money that was made available quite easily, well, the problem is that there will be a problem, an issue with the consent to pay taxes, especially in countries where the tax pressure is already very high or strong. You know, as I said earlier, in my opinion, increasing the fiscal burden, the tax burden, when the activity by applying a pressure on the activities that generate this this money, it's nonsense. And I think the taxing the digital activities is essential, but we often forget. We have to be careful during this period. A lot of operation that could be taxed. There's a mobility. And we forget that. Once the pressure is too strong, there's a leak. There's an evasion. And the main discussions that businesses have is how we can avoid paying taxes. How can we move the head office, for example? And so we have to always bear in mind this risk of mobility. So besides the taxing, the green tax and taxing the digital world, there's the repatriation, relocation, for example, the research tax breaks and credits. So we have to think of a tax approach that encourages entrepreneurship and small businesses. And I think one of the last idea I'd like to propose here is that we should work. How do we master public expenditures? You know, the citizens see this flow of money, but how do you control? How do you master public expenditures? Shouldn't the state concentrate on its missions? Is each euro well spent? Where does the tax money go? In short, and I'll ask the Minister Cardenas, since there have been so many transfers to the households in Togo, for example, they set up the first direct transfer to families or households for those who did not have the means to survive. So could we eventually be witness to new public policies via the taxing system that would lower the informality of the economy? So if you want to benefit from aids, you know, should we increase the tax base, and we could eventually rethink for Africa, for example, the self-financing is 15%. For Holland, it's 46% of the state budget. Mauricio, merci.
Said the previous issue of the carbon taxation, the point that Isabel mentioned, just briefly, because I think I have a different point of view, which is that carbon taxes are not going to solve the fiscal crisis. I mean, fiscal deficits are going up by trillions of dollars. And even in a country like the US, a relatively high carbon tax would only produce a few $100 billion. So it's really far away from the increases in revenues that are needed to reduce the fiscal deficits. But they will solve the next crisis, which is the climate crisis. And therefore, we should try to take this opportunity, because people are much more cognizant and aware of the risks with the next white swan, which is climate, to introduce taxes that help us curb carbon emissions. And I think this applies to every country in the world. It's not just a matter of advanced economies. That's why, for example, when I was finance minister a couple of years ago, we introduced the carbon tax here in Colombia. It's a relatively low tax compared to the levels that exist in Europe. It's a $5 per ton of CO2 tax, but yet helps in reducing carbon emissions, because our countries need to contribute to the reduction in carbon emissions, because, by the way, we are also one of the most affected and impacted regions of the world by climate change. The number of effects related to increase in sea level, the issues related to El Niño and La Niña, droughts and floods. So it's important to be part of the solution. And curbing carbon emissions is, I guess, what we know from a scientific point of view, the most important thing we can do to reduce climate change. Changing to informality. Absolutely. Informality has become a central issue in the conversation today, because, as I said before, it's an amplifier of the pandemic. And it's one of the key elements that constrain the ability of the state to raise revenues, the high levels of informality. So we should take advantage of this opportunity as well to formalize firms and formalize jobs. The governments are providing very significant subsidies to the payrolls. They should use those subsidies also to create incentives for people to move into formality. Businesses that employ more formal jobs, paying a subsidy. And this will, of course, in the future, will have a dividend in terms of increase in the tax base. So informality is really the key issue that we need to tackle right now. And this could be a great opportunity to provide the incentives for businesses and jobs to formalize. How to do that? It's also about reducing taxes on the payroll. That was also another experiment that we introduced here in Colombia. By cutting payroll taxes, firms are more inclined to hire workers with full contracts, under formal contracts. So payroll taxation, which was introduced in Latin America in the 1950s, and it's pervasive, it's everywhere in the region, should migrate into personal income taxes and corporate income taxes. That's the way in which you can also create incentive for firms to hire more workers under formal schemes.
Merci, Mauricio.
Thank you, Mauricio. So to conclude on this topic of consent, Pascal Saint-Amand, you were one of the first to set the alarm after the crisis on this hatred of or this resort to tax evasion. As an economist, I often think that maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, the central bank, we'll say the central banks will have rescued the people who save. Is that something that worries you? You know, well, the answer is yes. It was the case in 2008, where we saw for the first time as the G20, the countries addressed the issue of tax evasion and tax fraud with the lifting of the bank secrecy. Mario, who I'd like to thank, he was the Ministry of Finance. In Panama, they say that we'll exchange information automatically with Colombia. So it's the end of bank secrecy. Switzerland does that with France, with Germany, and the rest of the world. So there was a very strong reaction. We put a second layer in 2013 that we called the BEPS. It was an English acronym to talk about the erosion of the transfer of benefits and so on and so forth. And there, again, the G20 said we have to put a stop to that. And today we have a new layer, yet another layer, where the people will not understand that corporations or businesses or rich people who are, let's say, capable of evading or delocalizing can escape. Where the enterprises have benefited from with partial unemployment, for example, they were helped. And so the tolerance for this behavior will be zero. And this will lead to the fact that the countries will want to regulate tax competition. Germany is very active to that effect, and they propose to set up sort of like a minimum tax level worldwide. So if a country wants to move its business in a country where there's not tax, we're talking about 12.5%, well, the countries will take the difference. So there will no taxes under a certain rate. And then the countries can decide. Those countries who are at 20 or 30%, the smaller countries will be between 12 and 20%, but there will be a safety net. We talked about the digital economy. And make sure that these corporations, these companies pay more than they pay today in their market countries. Sometimes they pay nothing. And when for the physical people, there will be a debate on taxing high revenues. We don't know how this debate will evolve, but there will be something done in that way. And I think it's a good. We don't want to stop investments here or hamper investments. We have to be reasonable in the approach. I think that the taxing measures have to remain, keep the incentives for entrepreneurship. But those who carry the burden are often the people in the streets, you know, and these people are revolted. We observed in 2010, 2011, when we pulled out of the 2008 crisis, that the countries all increased the VAT level. to move towards more austerity. Now, this is no longer possible, and so we'll have to find other means, other ways. But once again, the position of the OECD is don't increase taxes immediately. Wait, and then maybe you will not have to increase the taxes. Maybe the debt will be sustainable if you keep low interest rates. Bit less true for emerging countries like Colombia, but for developed economies, don't rush. Let's not precipitate. Let's not rush and increase taxes. So we clearly see in what you say, Pascal Saint-Amand, that we're at the heart of questions that are ethical, in line with political cohesion. Now, taxing. Should it have the objective of, should it aim at leading to a better social justice, at a more equity, more fairness? We have constant debates and permanent debates in France on the taxing of the rich, on the reestablishment of these different taxes to the rich, the ISF in France. So in Germany, how do you perceive these Franco-French debates?
It's a very important debate, and to come back to what Pascal just said, to support companies to preserve employment through the crisis, yes, please. Try and find the French channel, because I understood I can speak French if I wish. So here I go. Can you hear me now? Can he speak French? Yes, please, let me speak French. Please. Now, can you hear me now? Okay. So to support companies throughout the crisis and to preserve employment throughout the crisis is exactly what should be done. But this implies, of course, secondary effects, side effects, for the benefit of owners, lenders. And that's why I wish to talk about just after Mr. Seguin, because if people say, okay, let's give those gifts to the owners and the lenders, and then let's run and go abroad so as not to pay tax. And this is unacceptable. And this is socially and economically unacceptable. So it's very clear to me, it's obvious that what we're doing is the right thing. However, we must ensure that then there is fair taxes so that people with wealth don't run away with their real estate and don't pay taxes. So it's the case for us, just like for France. This idea, this initiative for a minimum taxation on a global scale, there's an immediate connection with the crisis. And I'm quite admirative with what the OECD has been done in the field. And also Pascal's personal work. Now, does this imply that we have to increase the tax rate after the crisis? Not necessarily, but we must ensure that people do not evade the tax simply because they can move more easily around. Or because they can pay the highest and most prestigious lawyers, so that social tax justice cannot be avoided. However, taxation is not the only thing to create a fair balance economically in society, because for the great part, what the state does is to spend money, the money they collected through taxes So fiscal and economic justice in society is not created through tax itself, but through the way the state uses it. So let's not say we have to fix any sort of inequality through tax, because there's also public spendings. However, without taxes, we won't have balanced economies after the crisis. Okay, we just heard you. Now let's have a look at another context, that of Morocco. What about the question of the place and role of taxes within the social contract in your country, Mohamed Soual? Well, in fact, there are two levels where tax justice can be considered. First, at a global level, we can examine the question of tax justice quite serenely. Today, Europe is very much concerned with the taxation issue, and one of those big issues is that of the GAFAs. That is all the questions connecting to multinational companies, transfer prices, tax optimization that deprive the states of tax resources. There are also all the questions linked with free trade agreements, where with tariffs, several standards have been considered as are used as actual barriers in commercial exchanges. Now, at a national level, I think there are principles, important principles that are some sort of progressivity of the tax, where the citizens, be they individuals or corporations, must pay in accordance with their incomes. We saw theories that were outcomes of what was called the running down effects. That is, you give less to those who have much, and then this will trickle down on spendings. But I'm not sure about the validity of such theories. Now, in countries from my side of the Mediterranean, and I'm taking the example of Africa, what is at stake is to work in order to enlarge the taxable base so that we can create an informal sector that would not be taxed. But this informality could also have impact on the sector, and that's what you said earlier. It would help people consent to the tax. Now, you give me the opportunity to talk about my country, and in order to face the impact of the crisis, governments took several interesting measures, such as, and in fact, they were inspired by the head of state, that is our king. And we asked all of those who could fuel fund to help us fight the crisis, and the effect was really incredible because individuals and corporations contributed, and within 48 hours, we managed to have the equivalent of 3 billion euros that allowed the state to face the effect of the crisis, to improve health condition, to have more equipment, and also to have temporary layoff measures. And the money was distributed quite rapidly to millions of citizens that were in fragile situations. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we only have 10 minutes left. And before addressing the questions that people on the internet are asking, maybe Pascal, we were talking about a massive intervention of the state in Morocco. Pascal, will we enter some sort of a dumping era for tax? Is that a risk? L'interprète s'excuse, mais l'orateur est inaudible. The interpreter is sorry, but we cannot hear the speaker. Oh, here we are. Now, okay, he's connected, so. No, there's no risk of fiscal competition. I think we're heading forward strong regulation of taxation because we have populism throughout the world with people either on the far right or far left, but we are very close to finding an agreement so that we have a safety net for companies and also for individuals. The ability to switch from a country to another is not as easy as before. So also the taxation on companies has decreased. On average, it's about 25%, and it should be stabilized around this figure. So the idea is that of a regulation, because the massive intervention of the state will mean that there will be more tax responsibility. Okay, so this leads us to one of the questions asked. What sort of a reform to improve consent to tax? So maybe we can focus on the French case. The question was addressed with the yellow jackets. So, well, in fact, says Ludovica, I'd like to have an answer. Let's talk about what Mauricio said. That is, what about income tax? And there will be a real turnover so that a tax is used through channels that are well known. So we are all concerned about, in the last 2 years, we've had great difficulties with agreement to tax, and this is also part of the pension reform. So I don't know if our speakers wish to talk. Well, I can see Hubert's face when he hears that people will agree to tax. No, in fact, tax evasion and so forth, I think we should have taken those measures a long time ago. But there's a difference between tax evasion and state competition. In the last 30 years and the experience I've had, if you think that there won't be tax competition between states so that they can attract the wealthiest companies or individuals, I don't believe in that. I think that a minimal tax rate is a really good idea so as to avoid such a competition. But many countries are outside Europe and might attract people or companies. So I think the measures are the good ones. And among all the experts, none of us saw the Yellow Jacket movement. None could predict it. And it's a movement that is started from the basis, but not only. So the idea is that it's a vertical refusal to pay tax. Is that right? Well, so facing those tax differences between states that can fuel competition, but also evasion, well, should we not have some sort of a European tax of revenues? Maybe this is a question for the OECD and Pascal Saint-Amand. Well, 2 points. What Hubert says is true, but if we took those measures in Europe, it would be meaningless. But in fact, I have 137 member countries. So it's people from from Europe, but also Switzerland, the Cayman Islands. So what we're doing is with most of the countries, and this is the key, that is a taxation at a global level and cooperative taxation. Otherwise, we will have some sort of a closing down of frontiers in terms of taxes, which would severely damage the economy. So we need this cooperation, and not only at a European level. Now, concerning Europe, should we have some sort of a uniform taxation of salaries? Well, I'm not sure we're taking the question the right way. Do we have only one social European model? Don't forget that taxes are used to finance country spendings. Now, maybe taxes are too high in France. Maybe in others, they are not high enough. So we need to adapt the tax level to spendings, and then try to have something more harmonious. So maybe we could tax corporations more than individuals for mobility questions, but states are sovereigns and they can use their veto. So it's quite difficult to find some sort of harmony in Europe. So we have a second best, and we are trying to move forward using cooperation with 137 countries. Thank you, Pascal Saint-Amand. Maybe Jacob, you can have the final word. You are heading the Europe. So we are expecting much of you in terms of taxes, environment, response to crisis. What about tax leadership of Germany in this presidency at a European level?
Obviously, there are big things to manage during our presidency. And in the end, we don't need a qualified majority. We need a unanimous decision. So it won't be whether it's France or Germany, you know, it's all the countries that have to get together. And I think the biggest test that's ahead of us for the presidency will be to organize the relaunching fund. There was a proposal from France, good proposal. And there's a proposition from the European Commission. And now I think we have to reach a consensus with a real element of solidarity to help the regions and countries that are most affected by the crisis and by the COVID-19. And that's the first biggest challenge. But there are others. There's the challenge of the Brexit, the challenge of the European budget. I hope we can resolve together or find a solution for the rebuilding fund, but clearly for reasons I mentioned earlier and that others mentioned or raised, this issue of taxing is part of the topics we have to deal. And the first way is how we can have a real carbon tax, whether it's the cost for a certificate or we call it a certificate or a tax. Economically, it boils down to the same. It's important that it increases, that it be there, and that it is synchronized with our project to have economy in Europe that's neutral when it comes to its emissions by 2050. And so this is the first big challenge. Well, this is a debate we will continue later because now we've reached the end of this session dedicated to the tax justice at the service of social justice. So thank you all for taking part in this debate and for your precious contributions. And I remind you that this Rencontre Économique continue today, Saturday and up to Sunday evening. Thank you very much to all of you.